So welcome to Creating and Deleting Landscapes. In this video, we're going to be creating an Unreal project in an existing repo, which is a little bit different to what we've done before. We'll talk about what's good about landscapes in the Unreal Engine straight after this slide. I'll show you how to add a landscape in Unreal, which is slightly trickier to find than you'd hope. I'll show you how to delete a landscape in Unreal. So, what's good about landscapes? Well, they use a sixth or so of the storage of a static mesh. Another way of doing a landscape you may think would be to use Blender or Maya or 3D Studio or ZBrush or blah to make a static mesh and then import that as a landscape. The problem is that a static mesh uses 24 to 28 bytes per vertex of data, whereas a Unreal landscape only uses 4, so you end up with about a sixth of the storage space. Much better. It supports level of detail and level streaming if done properly, so it can break the landscape up into parts and decide which of those parts to show at what level of detail, and which to load when, and which to not even try and render when. And we'll be talking about that in the next video, exactly with the details, but it's really good for this. It can support up to 8196 by 8196 pixel height maps for import. Now, what's a height map? A height map's a black and white image that tells the system for each part of the terrain exactly what height it should be. Now, if you were to use a typical scale in Unreal of 1 meter resolution on your terrain, then you could potentially specify up to 8 by 8 kilometer maps and make them in an external program and import them into Unreal. So that's pretty cool. But it's also got very good built-in tools for sculpting and manipulating terrain, and that's what we're going to be using. And the landscape or terrain system works very well with mini-maps. If you do want an example of an external tool that's great at making procedurally generated, very believable terrains, then look at TerraGen or World Machine. So, remembering our iterative cycle, we're here in World, then we're going to move on to the tank, Controls, Player 2, and then back to the world. So we're only going to make a first look at this world this time. Just going to make a very basic world, then get some type of a tank down, and then go round and round this iterative cycle. Okay, so let's take a look at how to do it. We need to go back a step, of course, because where were we? Well, I was busy adding these very boring files to source control that were just documentation files to show you how to use the README. But what has this done on my disk? When I said clone stroke new, I had a destination path in here of my standard repo directory, which meant that SourceTree has kindly made me a directory called 04 Battletank, which just has these 3 files in it. What we need to do now, just as we did back in Building Escape, is make a subdirectory that actually has our Unreal folder. And then we need to talk about a subtlety while it all loads of the gitignore. So let's open the Epic Games Launcher. And we're going to point it to our repos folder that we've just made, where the repository already exists. The smoking gun for a repository is the .git file and the .gitignore file, but the .git file is the reliable one. So here we are in in Epic Games Launcher. Let's launch the engine. I'm using 4.10.4. Any 4.10 will do. You could even use a slightly later version, but I do recommend not going too far ahead of that if you're watching this at some time in the distant future. So we're going to make a new project. Let's think about how to make our decisions on the new project. Always a C++ project, because we can derive blueprint classes from C++, so we can always just have very thin C++ classes and extend in Blueprint later. So I always go C++, basic code. We don't need any of the rest of this stuff. We can actually add any of this content later on, and I'll show you how. Desktop, maximum quality, no starter content. For the moment, that's cool. In the Battletank folder, let's make a subfolder called Battletank. Now just check the paths look right and go ahead and create project. Fantastic. Now it's going to spend a little bit of time creating the project, and then eventually Unreal will open and Visual Studio will open. So meanwhile, let's go and look here in the file system. Of course, a Battletank folder has been created with all these files in it. That's great. Now, the gitignore file. The difference with this one we got from the GitHub website is it has a different syntax. It says, all of these actually say intermediate /*, which means ignore anything in an intermediate folder that is in this directory that I'm in, the gitignore. And if you note, there is no intermediate folder here in this directory. It lives here in the subfolder. So intermediate will actually not be ignored by this one. Hold on, it's popping up in front of me. If we contrast this with the gitignore we had back in Building Escape, we said */. Now that means ignore intermediate, including in any subfolders. So we have a slightly different gitignore file in this case. So the way to make sure that this operates properly with this slightly different gitignore is to simply move the gitignore into the Battletank folder. Before I show that, let me just show you the problem and solution. Here, back at SourceTree, now that all these files have existed, look at the unstaged files. They include tons of intermediates, for the reason I've just explained, right? So what I'm going to do is move the getignore into BattleTank. The advantage is it will now work, provided that, of course, we stage our .getignore file. So find anything that refers to .getignore, stage it, and then you'll see no mentions of intermediate. Great, so that's working well. The disadvantage of this method, of course, is that if we put anything at this up top level of the folders, that will be put under source control. But that's fine. We're doing everything inside the BattleTank folder. So that's a perfectly good solution for now, and let's crack on with the actual job of making a terrain. So here we are in Unreal. What map are we in for a start? We're in an untitled map, so I'm going to save that, and I'm going to call it Battleground. Okay, and of course what you always want to do when you make your first map is you go to your maps and modes under your project settings, and then make sure that both your default game map and your default editor map are the new thing, Battleground. Cool. So we have a nice sky box here, but we don't need this floor. So delete your floor from the world. And you're in this situation now where you would just have pretty much nothing in the world apart from a light source, some atmospheric fog, and a player start point. So what I want you to do, slightly strangely as a challenge, is I want for you to try and add your own landscape without me even telling you how. See if you can find where it is and how to add it. The reason is it'll help you get familiar with the interface. I want you to start without using a web search or any documentation. Use any settings for the landscape when you do find it. We'll delete it and re-add it later because you need to have that skill. And then share how long it took you to find it with the rest of us and whether you needed to go to the web. So go ahead, try and add any old landscape now. So welcome back. Where's the landscape? Well, it's actually under modes. Like a lot of the things when you first start, you're either going to get content like pre-existing assets from some starter pack, which we don't have right now, or you're going to modes. Now in modes, you can do things like add actors, box triggers, lights, visual effects, BSP, binary space partitions, which can be useful for meshing out levels, volumes, all sorts of cool volumes, and then all classes. And under all classes, if we scroll is the word I'm looking for, down we'll find landscape. So one way of doing it is you just drag a landscape in. Let me do that. And there it is. Now it'll come in at a weird position depending on where you let go of it. But this is a perfectly valid way of doing it. Note, by the way, that once you do that, it'll switch across to the landscape tab, and then you'll be on the manage part of that. And it's basically saying to you, do you want to create a landscape here? So I'm going to do it because this is like you creating one in a rough way. It's the wrong size, etc. But at least we've got a landscape in. Now notice that under modes and then the landscape tab, the manage tab does something slightly different. It has different options on it. It doesn't have very many options. Okay, so let me show you a second way whilst showing you how to delete a landscape. Deleting is easy. You just find it in the world outliner, right click, edit, and delete. So that's why you can add a landscape with confidence, because it's pretty easy to delete it later. So how else could you add a landscape? You could go to the landscape tab from the start. Now the manage sub-tab will recognize there is no landscape in the scene and say, well, you obviously want to create one or import a height map from a file. But we're going to create a new one. And we're going to think about exactly the size that we create this at in the next video, because we want to think a little bit carefully about where this is, i.e. at the origin, or not, how it's rotated, how it's scaled, what this section size, the number of sections, the number of components, what does all this stuff mean? It's the topic of a whole video because we want to get it right and we want to understand our constraints on our landscape. So well done on getting this far. Hopefully you now know how to add a landscape and delete it and where to find everything, and your project source control is all set up, ready to go. All that remains, of course, is to close everything. Doesn't matter whether you've got a landscape, not got a landscape, you know how to delete them now. We're going to be doing it in the next video. So with everything closed, I'm now going to stage everything. Now I'm getting a warning that my battletank.vc.db is bigger than 10 meg. Well, we chose to ignore that before, so let's go ahead and edit the getignore. Find generated by the engine. Where should we put it? Because we didn't write this, we need to think about where to put it. It's not under any of these, so I'm just going to put it at the top, star.vc.db. This only applies, of course, to you Visual Studio users, and this is the database file, 250 meg. That's the one we want to ignore. So save that. I'm going to cancel the staging, re-add the getignore. Now stage everything, and now we're happy. We don't have any big files, okay? So there's two approaches to getting to your git ignore. You either build it up from the scratch yourself, or you start with somebody else's and modify it. But you still need to know how it works, otherwise it becomes a weird black box. So go ahead, make your commit, and I'll see you in the next video.